Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. We're so pleased to welcome Linda Nemec Foster in support of her new collection, The Blue Divide, this evening, and joined in conversation after a reading by our friend poet Keith Taylor. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed this evening, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase the Blue Divide from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature available to you on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. And I will ask a selection of those questions at the conclusion of Linda's conversation with Keith. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming, whether you'd like to think of it as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming. You can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Linda Nemec Foster is the author of 12 collections of poetry. Her work has been published in magazines and journals such as the Georgia Review, Nimrod, Quarterly West, Witness, New American Writing, and Verse Daily. Foster's poems have appeared in anthologies from the US and UK, been translated in Europe, inspired original music compositions, and have been produced for the stage. Her first commissioned libretto, Spirit of the Lake, will have its world premiere in 2022. She has received over 30 nominations for the Pushcart Prize and awards from the Arts Foundation of Michigan, ArtServe Michigan, National Writers' Voice, the Poetry Center, and the Academy of American Poets. From 2003 to 2005, she served as the first poet laureate of Grand Rapids, Michigan. In the fall of 2019, she was the poet in residence at the University of Bielsko-Biała in Poland. Her new book, The Blue Divide, was published in 2021 by New Issues Press. Foster is the founder of the Contemporary Writers Series at Aquinas College. And joining her later after a reading for a conversation, Keith Taylor is originally from Western Canada, but has lived for the past 45 years in Michigan. His last full-length collection, The Birdwhile, won the bronze medal for the Forward Indies Poetry Book of the Year. His poems, stories, reviews, essays, and translations have appeared widely in North America and in Europe. He has recently retired from the University of Michigan, where he taught creative writing for 20 years. They can't hear it, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in a round of applause and welcome Linda Nemec Foster and Keith Taylor into your living rooms.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for hosting us. Thank you so much for my good friend and colleague, Keith Taylor, for joining me later in a little conversation about the book. So I will begin by reading poems from The Blue Divide that actually start from the beginning. I won't be reading the very first poem from the book, but I'll be going in order as the books appear, or as the poems appear in the book. And the first few poems take us to the other side of the world, to Europe. And the first poem I'd like to read for you is called The Cypress Trees in Croatia. I visited Dubrovnik in 2014. There's a forgotten history in that part of the world. There was the awful Balkan War from 1992 to around 1995. It was probably the worst genocide and ethnic cleansing that Europe had seen since World War II. And a lot of people seem to have forgotten that. And I'm hoping with this poem to reimagine those lives and also give honor to the resilience of those people that came through that war. One thing you should know, I talk about this very strong wind in Croatia called Bura, B-U-R-A. It's very much like a hurricane strength wind that whips around Croatia on the Adriatic Sea. So that's, I think, all you need to know. And this is The Cypress Trees in Croatia. The women speak as if they are singing, and who could blame them? Their war ended only 20 years ago. The bullet holes from the Serbian guns still visible in the walls of the fire station in Dubrovnik. But how do they sing? Their low Slavic voices have long abandoned the illusion of perfect pitch. They know it's a myth, a fragment of a mermaid song. Their mouths would rather mimic the air around the cypress trees standing sentinel to hillsides that have witnessed too much silence. Their mouths embrace the cold, numbing air of Bura, the wind of November that echoes their voices as they sing from the valley of their throats. We're still in that part of the world, the Balkan Peninsula, the former Yugoslavia. And what amazed me was during that war, they would still produce plays and dramatic performances and concerts. I think it's just remarkable during that time. So this is about a performance of Hair, the American musical Hair, that was performed in Sarajevo. And the title of the poem is Report from Bosnia, Hair performed in Sarajevo. The age of Aquarius is sung in broken English to a packed house in a small room. The actors do not take off their clothes at the play's finale. We're already naked from the war, one singer says. But they ask the audience to sing and join them on a tiny stage. They perform only when there's electricity. More than a dozen performances have been interrupted or stopped because of mortar shells. The artistic director, who also doubles as the bass guitarist, plays with a gun strapped to his waist. Black revolver stolen from the cold grip of a dead Serb. A young boy sitting on his mother's lap in the fourth row smiles for the camera. My name begins with A, he says, through an interpreter, just like Aquarius. Next week, he will be killed with 8 others, standing in line for bread. At his grave, there is only his picture nailed to a wooden board. No name. They've run out of letters. I want to still stay in Europe, but a different part of Europe and a different vibe and tone to this next piece. We go from the conflict of war to an interesting conversation between a husband and his dead wife in a restaurant. And this is called Café de Paris, Geneva, Switzerland. Believe it or not, there is a Café de Paris in Geneva, and they call it Café de Paris. So here you go. The restaurant only serves 1 entree with 2 side orders, steak, salad, and French fries. That's it. It's that simple. No need for menus, no need to read French or Italian or German, no need to stutter with an American accent. The widower from Brussels at the next table had a wife who was a vegetarian. She wouldn't be caught dead in a place like this. The smell of the meat would be enough to put her over the edge. She's dead, so it's a moot point, but not for her husband, who still dreams her alive. He remembers, like it was just last week, how she berated him for eating a greasy hamburger. Not because it was greasy, but because it came from a cow, just like the quiet cows that dot the Swiss countryside outside Geneva. Just like the cow he's eating now, medium rare, slightly bloody. His wife hated meat, but approved of the ancient world's ritual of gazing at slaughtered animals' entrails to predict the future. He envisions her frown appearing in the reflection of the red juices cooling on the plate. Her mouth opens in disbelief. You moron. What do you think you're doing eating in a place like this that doesn't even know what tofu is? Think of your heart, your congested, breaking heart. Some of you who have read my poetry before know I love visual art. As a matter of fact, I think I'm a frustrated visual artist that never got beyond stick people. I love ekphrastic poetry. I've written a lot of pieces based on the famous, the infamous, and not so famous art pieces. So I have several long sequences in the book. One is entitled Sequence, the Artist's Notebook. I won't read the entire sequence, but three pieces, three sections from that sequence, and they can all stand alone on their own. So this is entitled How to Paint an Approaching Storm. Pick a clear day while they still exist. Blue sky, yellow sun, the predictable boredom of a calm landscape. Blend in the anxiety of waiting, the cicadas suddenly hushed, the hawk lost in its endless spiral, keep mixing the afternoon in colors that are silent, gray of stone, black of the stone shadow, the palette of dusk arriving too soon. Close your eyes and count to 100, to your birthday, to the square root of memory, until the sky splits into a crooked river of light. Now stop. Feel the rain on your face as if for the first time, as if you have never been here before. Another piece from the Artist's Notebook. This is based on the Baroque artist Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, very famous, lived in Italy from 1598 to 1680. He was quite an amazing sculptor, not an amazing man, which I'll get to in the poem, but his work was really phenomenal. And his subjects were either Catholic saints or Roman and Greek mythology. Backstory: the open mouth of Saint Teresa and her ecstasy, the death of Blessed Ludovica and its mirage of light, Pluto's wide hand on the marble thigh of Proserpina, and the tears that seemed to stream down her cheek. All of this passion by Bernini can overwhelm any young tourist, but it's his Daphne and Apollo, the girl growing leaves and roots while the god is in hot pursuit, that makes my daughter gasp, better than Michelangelo. But she doesn't know Bernini's backstory, the jealous rage that made him force a servant to slash a woman's face until it wasn't a face. But why ruin the moment? No artist is perfect, even though the art can be. Consider his Teresa and her angel. The marble floats as if it's already in heaven. Just one more piece from the Artist's Notebook, and this is the last section that closes it. And it's inspired by a modern contemporary American artist, Jim Carsina, who was born in Minnesota, but lived many years in Michigan and Grand Rapids. He was a very, very dear friend of myself, my husband, my entire family. And this is inspired by a wonderful gift he gave to my son and his wife, my son's wife, on their wedding. This is called Gift. A year before my son met the woman he'd marry, you painted this landscape of rocks, water, and thin line of horizon, the place consumed by a lake and its obsession with the idea of blue. The idea hugs the shore and won't let go, not for the stark branch insisting on its existence, or the boulders losing their sense of decorum with wild layers of movement. Isn't that how love works? The spinning and falling, obsessing and wondering what happens next. The view from this high bluff can't predict the future, let alone the future of our children. Impossible to know from this height. All we can do is give the gift and tell them to hold on to each other, to that idea of blue, the expanse of the landscape that can't be contained in a single image, that's what you give them. Another poem about visual art, about the actual process of creating it on the blank page. The Dream of Maine for Margot Berkey. You've never been there, but your hands imagine this place where land, sea, and sky come together so effortlessly. It reminds you of the perfect woven cloth, seamless like water. And just as effortlessly, the brown hill rises from the beach and rocks become green, covered with strands of kelp, like tossed hair combed by the ocean. As if every color you layer on the paper surface leaves your hand and creates its own life, as persistent as the clouds overwhelming any hint of blue. But what is beyond the horizon of this place you've never seen? Only this, you surrounded by Maine, not a mere longing in your heart, but Maine and your son, still young enough to hold in your arms, and the deep cobalt blue of the ocean, a small gesture away. This next poem is a tribute to the great Japanese artist Hokusai, who did so many amazing views of Mount Fuji in his work, in his portfolio. My dear friend, Therese Becker, another dear friend, she died about 5.5 years ago. She loved Hokusai, but couldn't afford the real thing. So this is my tribute to her and her reproduction of Hokusai. Mount Fuji. My friend always wanted to see the mountain with its eternal snow, but she never crossed the ocean to Japan. Instead, she bought a small reproduction of Hokusai's Boy Viewing Mount Fuji and hung it on her bedroom wall. Every morning, it greets the daylight, the boy with his back to her as he faces the mountain and plays a flute. His body perfectly balanced on a thick tree branch that seems to slice Fuji's heart with a rugged abandon. In another life, she vows, I'll come back as that flute, the hollow reed content to be held and hidden in the boy's hands. Therese was also a fine photographer besides being a writer. And she gave me this one beautiful photograph before she died, and she entitled it All That We Cannot Name. And keep in mind, she took it with an old school camera, not a digital camera or not an iPhone, an old school camera. So this is called All We Cannot Name. Your eye sees one thing, the camera imagines another. Shape disappears into weightless blue, light becomes a shadow's mirror. Image floats to the surface like a language you've never heard, fluid lines of exotic characters, as if an ancient riddle poses a question in the momentary stillness of the camera's held breath, and you know it will take your whole life to learn the answer. Now let's get to family and heritage and family history. Recently, I was involved with the Kalamazoo Poetry Festival a couple of weeks ago. I was asked to participate and read a couple of poems from the Blue Divide. And Patricia Smith, great poet Patricia Smith, was the keynote speaker, one of the keynote speakers, and did a wonderful reading. And she said something very true. She says, you should never forget where you came from. Even though you leave it, even though it may not be in your rearview mirror, it should never leave you. So this is where I came from, a very poor inner city neighborhood in Cleveland. It was called Slavic Village. In the 1900s, a lot of immigrants from Poland and Russia and Ukraine and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Estonia, Latvia, they all lived there. Again, it was economically very poor. marginalized, a lot of unemployment. That's where I came from. And now it still maintains the word Slavic village, but now there are new immigrants that live there from Mexico, from South America, from Central America. And there's a strong African-American population there too. So the faces have changed, but it's still inner city, marginalized, and poor economically. So this is a tribute to that section of Cleveland. The Immigrants in Slavic Village, Cleveland, 1955. The Hungarian kids wear thin jackets, missing buttons, stain of paprika in their mouths. The Czechs pretend they know everybody's secrets, even those of Slovak Joe, who spits at their shadows. The Ukrainians can't stand the only neighbors who can understand their language, those goddamn Russians who starved their grandparents to death in the 20s. The Lithuanians refuse to open the blinds after dusk, something about the night air stealing the breath of infants. And the Poles, those men and women in love with the Black Madonna, wash their hands before touching their children, the sons and daughters as pale as water. At night, the moon gets tangled in the open arms of the dead oak tree on Salem Avenue and can't decide if it's winter or spring, summer or fall. The same bareness waits to embrace it every night. This poem is about my daughter and about my attempts to be an astrophysicist when I was younger. Folks, you may not know that I did not want to be a writer or poet from the beginning. When I was 7, I wanted to go into astronomy and I wanted to go into physics. And then I hit a brick wall in high school when I took the heavy science classes, and geometry and trig killed me. So I knew that science was not in my future, but it wasn't the future for my daughter. My daughter majored in astronomy and physics in college. So this is about that. And it's about the theory of everything, that mysterious theory of physics, the theory of everything. And it begins with a quote from a catalog from the teaching company, what they have to say about the theory of everything. This is an interesting quote. A vision of physical reality so at odds with our experience that it defies language. The theory of everything. Einstein's theory of relativity can be stated in one concise sentence, but what is it? What noun placed next to what verb, modified by what adverb, holds the secret? I asked my daughter, the aspiring astrophysicist, to speak the sentence, and if not the concise sentence, then the undulating lines of pure thought that describe the theory of everything. Her mother, who froze in high school geometry, cannot comprehend how tiny strings vibrating in a microscopic universe can hold everything together, from DNA's double helix to the silky translucence of a moth's wings to Bach's concerto for 2 violins. How it can all be reflected in 11 dimensions, 11 parallel universes wrapped in empty space, a dark energy of nothing. My one-dimensional brain boggles as my daughter explains, but the messy world of an atom's nucleus, the photons and quarks, the positrons and muons, the WIMPs and Higgs boson, all blur in my tired head. She describes a famous physicist lecture. I can only imagine him at the podium with mismatched socks. Dark blue of sky, mistaken for dark black of night. No use searching my finite space for a unified theory, but I can barely recognize my own daughter as she lives more and more in her own universe and leaves my small world behind. The daughter who waxes and wanes like the moon, loves me and pulls away like the tides, listens to a rock group called the Magnetic Fields, sing about the unscientific mess of love, loses car keys, and forgets to turn off the stove when the primordial soup boils down to nothing. The daughter who as a child was lost in a Chicago museum filled with the physics of Magritte. And as a smaller child noticed the silica shimmering in a lake in Nova Scotia and deemed it diamonds. This woman who now peers at the stars in the night sky and sees the same brilliance. And in the morning thinks the warm air of a January thaw is not fog, but the broken snow on fire. The woman who knows the textbook explanation, yet wants to believe in the flames. The daughter who looks at me with my cosmology of tentative words, tentative silence, and tries to see the mother, the proof that experience does defy all language, and everything is connected, whether we can dare to believe it or not. I only have 2 more poems to read for you this evening from the book, and these are poems towards the end of the book. And we talked about family. We talked about the Slavic village neighborhood in Cleveland where I came from. I talked a bit about my son and his wife, my daughter. And these last 2 poems are, of course, about my mother and my father. So one is about my mother when she was still alive, and the other one is about my father after he passed. They both died. My father in 2009, my mother in 2012. So one thing about my mom, she only had an 8th grade education, but as she would say, she knew what she knew. And she was addicted to gossip magazines. I mean, we have People and National Enquirer. Well, back in the day, there were such tabloids as Confidential, The Lowdown, Hush Hush, Uncensored. She would read that constantly. That was her manna. She loved reading that stuff. And she loved to learn all the gossip about movie stars. So you'll hear about Ava Gardner and Jean Harlow and Joan Crawford and Ingrid Bergman. So those are the people that my mom always wanted to know about their private lives. I've also mentioned window wax in this movie, thinking about movies now, in this poem. And it was a precursor to Windex. So people would put this window wax on their mirrors and windows. It was sort of like a thick substance and it looked yucky, but then you wiped it off and your windows and mirrors were clean. I also talk about Prussian bluing. It was a laundry additive that you would put in your laundry and it was all blue. It made the water blue, but it would turn everything white in that washing machine to a pure white. So it was quite an amazing thing. When I was a kid, I couldn't believe that that could happen. So without further ado, this is about my mother. It begins with a great quote from Ava Gardner. And some journalist once asked her to describe show business. You know, what's your job like, Ava? Describe show business. And she said, quote, "It's the kissiest business in the world. You have to keep kissing people." Ava Gardner. A kiss is just a kiss. My mother, in her own words, didn't know much, but what she knew how to darn a sock's hole until its universe imploded into a white dwarf of string theories, how to polish window wax into a mirror until it reflected a gaze more intense than Snow White's stepmother, how to magically stir the cauldron of laundry to transform Prussian bluing into a pure white shirt. And then her encyclopedic knowledge of movie stars. She never called them actors or actresses, but stars, as in the heavens, the constellations, the Big Bang. Her lessons were taught by chain-smoking gossip columnists. She pored over their theses, illuminated in the pages of Confidential, the lowdown, hush hush, and uncensored. My mother could tell you how Jean Harlow really died. It wasn't kidney failure, but she was poisoned by all that peroxide she used on her hair. How Greta Garbo brushed her teeth. She never used toothpaste, only salt. How Joan Crawford plucked her eyebrows. She didn't, enough said. My mother loved the backstabbing of it, the kiss and tell of it, the guilty pleasure of it. And when she read this quote from Ingrid Bergman, a kiss is a lovely trick designed by nature to stop speech when words become superfluous. My mother, with her blue hands and absent husband, almost believed it. I will end my reading with the poem about my father. And this actually happened on the first anniversary of his death. I dream of my father. I don't exactly dream of him, but his voice. I'm calling from Krakow on the last night of my trip. Dad, I speak into the white phone. His voice on the other end sounds deep and hoarse, as if he has a bad cold or has been talking a lot. Yeah, he replies. I'm in Krakow, your mother's city. Oh, really? How's the weather? Fine, it's been good. I want to tell him about this place he's never seen. The market square gleaming like afternoon light, no matter what time of day it is. The starlings swooping like a black cloud in Grushka Street above the statues of the 12 apostles. Hearing my favorite Chopin nocturne played in the Bonarovsky Palace by a young Japanese woman. Gee whiz, I could hear him say, a Japanese woman living in Krakow. How that nocturne reminded me of him, the long goodbye I never got to say. But I just talk about inconsequential stuff. The heat wave that turned into a soft rain last night. The ugly Forum Hotel finally boarded up and turned into a giant billboard for Polish beer, the one and only Żywiec. That's nice, he says. Well, I gotta go. I've been talking too much over here, and I don't want to lose my voice. Somewhere on the edge of the city, a strong wind embraces the birch trees, changing their green leaves to silver in the thin morning.
Thank you, Linda. That was wonderful. It's great to hear you. Great to hear you read.
Thank you.
Yeah, always is. Even this way. Even this way.
Yes, yes.
As I read through the book, I came up with my questions, and I realized that my questions are a little general this time rather than specific. So we can start with my questions and get as specific as you want to get. The first one, which seemed important to me, and I thought might be important to people who know your poems or who want to know your poems, is a little bit about your process. And in my mind, I was phrasing it in terms like the last time I saw you read from a book was that wonderful book of Lake Michigan, the Lake Michigan fairy tale.
The Lake Michigan Mermaid. Yeah.
The Lake Michigan Mermaid. Yeah. And not that the poems were frivolous, not even that they're lighter, that's the wrong word, but there's an air to them of playfulness and things. And then you come to these poems and you start out with the war, and it's heavy, this even up to the end, those lovely poems for your parents at the end, there's still and you can even see, I noticed that in your demeanor. If nobody's ever heard you read before, they're going to think of you as this very serious reader, sort of staring intently into the camera. Whereas, those of us who've known you for 30 years know the playfulness that's often there. So what I'm wondering is this a progression? Is this a reflection of the time? On the other hand, I know how poems are made, and I know how long books come out. Were these poems written at the same time? Are these different emotional notes that Linda Nemec Foster plays, or is it indeed a change of perspective as we've gone on in these last few difficult years?
I think it's more the former. These are different notes that Linda Nemec Foster plays. For instance, for those of you who don't know about the Lake Michigan Mermaid, little sidebar, it did win a 2019 Michigan Notable Book. So it was in that category. It was a collaboration with Anne Marie Ullman, another poet and writer, and it was meant for a younger audience, let's say fifth, sixth graders and beyond. I mean, even high school people, college people, adults could get into it, but the base audience was a little bit younger. And there is a playfulness in that book simply because of the subject matter and the audience we were looking at. So even if you look at my earlier work, like Amber Necklace from Gdansk, which was published by LSU Press, about 19 years ago, that has a seriousness to it because it's about the first time I went back to Poland to visit the family that I just heard about but never met before, back in the late 90s. So that there's a historical seriousness and cultural edge to that book too. So I think this is just part of the process of who I am as a writer, as a person, and how I've developed over the years. Now, when you talk about process, I mean, just looking at various ways of physicality, I love to write on a legal pad. That's how I get my first thoughts on the page. And it's after many, many drafts, sometimes 8, 9, 10, 15 drafts, I'll go to the computer to play with the lines and the line break and the actual geography of the poem, how it looks on the page. But I always start with that very visceral physical activity of me, a pen, and I love to cross out stuff a lot. I get some comfort from that. I don't know, like making mistakes. I love to do that and say, well, let's, see what happens next to this image. But I know people who have read my work, even in Living in the Fire Nest, that came out in the late 90s. There is some gravitas there. There's some, seriousness. So, but there is also this very subtle playfulness. For instance, in Café de Paris, with the husband, the widower, and he's imagining the dead wife. And she says a line like, "You moron," something like out of The Honeymooners with, Jackie Gleason and Alice, "You moron." And I think what you have to do in life, especially with me as a poet, is know where I come from, know the history, the culture, the family relationships, and then move from there and develop that voice, but not forgetting, like Patricia Smith says, don't forget where you come from, but add that to who you are, in the present. So thanks for that question about process and how the poems evolve.
I was thinking while you were talking about the mermaid poems, there's this mythic figure way back you have in the Eastern European wise old woman, Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga. Yes.
Remember those poems.
Yeah, and there's myth. Thank you, Keith, for mentioning that, because I began those poems. It's a sequence, and it was in a little chapbook, but that chapbook is now out of print. But all those Baba Yaga poems were in Living in the Fire Nest, which came out in the late 90s from Ridgeway Press. So you could find them all, and you could find it on Amazon. You could find all that sequence there. And I was always very impressed with myth, folklore, fairy tales. That's why I worked with Liesl Mueller during my MFA years at Goddard College in Vermont, which is now the Warren Wilson College MFA program in North Carolina. But I wanted to work with Liesl because she used folklore and myth and fairy tale in her poems. And I was so intrigued with that subject that I wanted to inform my work with that. And so what I did for that semester when I worked with Liesl, I was writing these Baba Yaga poems, but she had me read not only the actual like first edition of the Grimm's Brothers, which I found in the Detroit Public Library, believe it or not, I found a first edition, not only the Grimm Brothers, Hans Christian Andersen, but also other Slavic folktale that most people would know of, Baba Yaga. I read original Russian, they called them Russian, I think Russian mystery tales, Russian mythology and folk tales and fairy tales, Polish folk tales and fairy tales, Czech, Hungarian, that just fed my semester when I worked on the sequence of, it's called Modern Fairy Tale, the Baba Yaga poems. And Baba Yaga is a very, in Russian culture and mythology, she's a very interesting creature. Let's put it that way. She's a witch. And there is a pictures at an exhibition, Mussorgsky. And second to the last piece in that music sequence is called The Hut of the Witch Baba Yaga. And that music sounds like it's flying, like the witch is actually flying the night sky. And actually it was that piece of Mussorgsky's music that made me want to write that sequence, because I thought it was so magical. So you're right, Keith. Folklore, fairy tale has always been, a part of what I love.
I'm glad you went there, because I wanted to take a minute to pick your brain about Liesl Mueller. The book is dedicated to her as if she's still alive. It's not in memory of. And then the second section of the book has an epigraph from her. And I just want to have you speak a few more words about her, because it's so different. Contemporary poets disappear so quickly after.
Keith,
let's take a moment to cherish Liesl Mueller.
Keith, that is the best question I've been asked for a long time. Thank you for letting me talk about her. Liesl Mueller was not only my mentor and teacher, she was my dear, dear friend for many years. I met her in 1977 when I first began my MFA program at Goddard College. I met her through Ellen Bryant Voigt, another great poet who introduced me to Liesl. And the first workshop I had as a graduate student, in the workshop was Liesl Mueller and Ellen Bryant Voigt. Oh, heaven, heaven, heaven. Liesl knew so much, not only about the world, but about how to live in it. She was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1924. She left Germany in July of 1939. If you know anything about history, you know what was going on later that year, September 1, 1939. World War II started when Germany invaded Poland. Her and her family got out just in time. She was a young girl, like 13, 14 years old. She settled first in Southern Indiana, where when she was a undergrad, she studied myth and folklore. That's how she got started with that love in her life. She later moved to Illinois, to the Chicago area. She lived in Lake Forest, and she was such a dear friend. She died last year, late February of 2020. We were actually in Hawaii right before I saw you, Keith, March 2nd there at Literati, when we read together for the Respect Anthology. We had just come back from Hawaii, and I was there on the Big Island when Liesl died, and her daughter, Jenny Mueller, another fine poet, called me on my cell phone to let me know her mom had passed. And I had been that night when Liesl was dying, we were on one of the top mountains where they have the observatories on the Big Island of Hawaii, Mauna Kea, and we were looking at the stars. Liesl has a wonderful, wonderful poem called Missing the Dead, where she talks about looking at the stars and thinking of the dead that have passed that she's loved so much. So that meant a lot to me, that here, that's what I was doing when Liesl Mueller was passing. Liesl's great book, Alive Together, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1996 out by LSU Press. If there's one book I would take with me on a desert island that would be the book, Alive Together. I'm honored that one of the poems in that book, Why We Tell Stories, is dedicated to me. I was working with Liesl as a grad student when she wrote that poem. She says, you know, if it wasn't for you, you inspired this poem, because that's when I was working with her with folklore and fairy tale in my own work. And I dedicated the book, The Blue Divide, to Liesl as if she is still here. Of course, the galley proofs, we were working on that. I was working on the rough drafts back in early 2020 before she died, and I want to keep that for Liesl Mueller. And I began I'm trying to think if I can see that wonderful blurb, not blurb, but this wonderful quote from her book, and a quote from a poem, Monet Refuses the Operation. It's one of her most anthologized poems, and it's this perfect persona poem where she assumes the voice of Monet, the Impressionist artist. And this is the very end of the poem, and I quote this. I think one of the sections begins with this quote. If only you could see how heaven pulls earth into its arms, and how infinitely the heart expands to claim this world, blue vapor without end.
Yeah, beautiful.
That's Liesl Mueller. And so, Keith, thank you so much for letting me talk a bit about her, but her spirit is in every page, is on every page in this book. Yeah. And I was so pleased I could dedicate the book to her. And
did she know you were going to do that?
No, she suffered from Alzheimer's.
Oh, that's right.
For the last, I'd say, 7 or 8 years of her life, but she still knew who I was. Right. I saw her just 2 weeks before we left for Hawaii. I saw her late January before we left for Hawaii. Yeah. And the last thing she did, she was in a nursing home, but she looked fine. I mean, she was 96 when she passed, but she took my hand and she kept kissing it. Very elegant, very European. She kept kissing my hand and she says, "It's always so good to see you, Linda. It's always so good to see you." She says, "When are you coming back?" I said, now I didn't know about her passing or the COVID lockdown, but I said, "We'll be back in the spring. We'll be back in March or April." But that was my last visit with her. And when you said that how we forget contemporary poets when they pass, it's so true. And a lot of people don't know about her. So
I know.
I'm glad you asked me to talk about her.
Good. Linda, I see that we have 7 Q&As there. So
oh boy. All right. We better get going.
Jump in and do those Q&As.
Well, you expertly anticipated at least a couple of them.
Good.
And we do have some comments. Patricia writes, "Lovely reading, Linda. Thank you." And there's a question from Anne Marie and
Hi,
David.
Anne. Hi, Anne Marie.
Anne Marie, love you.
Hello.
They ask, in your mother poem, you pull the laundry, stars, gossip, astronomy together and interplay. In your process, how do you find your way into that complexity?
Well, that particular poem, A Kiss is Just a Kiss, that went through, I would say, between 18 and 20 drafts, all by hand, before I got onto the computer. And my mother, sorry, Helen Nemec, this is true. She was an awful cook. She was not a good cook, but damn it, she loved to clean. She would live to do laundry 5 times a day if she could. She loved it. Something about it just, rang her bell. So I started out with the whole idea of her darning socks. And she couldn't sew that well either. I mean, her sister Mary could make dresses and hats and suits. My mother wasn't creative with sewing, but she knew how to darn a hole. And so it was that image of her limitation, like she didn't know much, but what she knew, she knew. So the limitations of my mom, the fact that she loved darning, the whole idea of sometimes when she got done with darning, this thing, that darned up the hole looked more like just a whole bunch of strings. It wasn't neat. It wasn't pretty because she wasn't creative with the needle. But the main thing was how she loved all that gossip about all these old Hollywood stars. And you couldn't tell her that Jean Harlow died of kidney failure. It was only, she dyed her hair using that peroxide. And so the whole idea of what my mother was and what she wasn't really defined the process of how I came to that poem. And I did leave a lot out, because I thought, no, I just want to really concentrate on these things, the whole idea of her liking to darn socks and doing laundry and cleaning with window wax, and then going into the whole idea of her living with those gossip columnists. So I just had to concentrate on that woman, and not what I wanted her to be, but what she was.
Thank you. A viewer writes, Auden talks about what hurt Yeats into poetry. What hurt you into poetry? What in your past most motivated you to become a poet? Wonderful reading.
Well, first of all, I love to read. Even long before I thought I wanted to be, remember, I wanted to be an astrophysicist, guys. Remember? The audience, that was, what my career goal was. And I love to read. What got me into poetry was Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. As I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. I quote him in the book too. One of the section pages has his quote. And I think it was the idea of the sound of language, the beauty of poetry, even though I may not have understood everything that Dylan Thomas wrote about. I sure love the way it sounded when I read it out loud. And the whole idea of the hurt, that's a very interesting question, because my childhood, I talked about that very poor Scrabble inner city neighborhood in Cleveland. I mean, we didn't go to the museums. We didn't go to concerts. We barely went to the library. It was a very, I think even below working class blue collar, it was like under there. And it was just my sense of the imagination. Can hurt feed an imagination? Another world, another way of being, figuring out who else I could be. And keep in mind, I was the first in my family, both my mother's side of the family in America, not in Poland, but in America, my mother's side of the family, my father's side of the family, I was the first one to go to college. My mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 10th grade education. And they, to be honest with you, they didn't value education as many parents do for their children. So maybe that was the hurt too, proving that I can be something else, still holding this history, this family history with me. And like Patricia Smith says, never losing it, but then going beyond it to make my own life, make my own place in the world.
Linda, your ability to extemporaneously answer these complex questions so swiftly has mesmerized me.
Well, you know what?
Just
this makes me feel good because I'm not young anymore, John. You're young. I'm not young. And it means that my brain is still working. So I'm grateful.
No, it's just you have historical ideologies and literary references. And I just feel like authors, if someone asked me that question, I'd hem and haw and wouldn't know what to say. So
thank you.
That's why I said early on, John, Linda and I could have gone for hours.
What was that, Keith?
you and I could have gone for hours.
Oh yeah. Listen, John and Keith and I could have gone for like 2 or 3 hours. Yeah.
Well,
it would have been very interesting. Nobody would have been bored.
No, I think it would have been one very interesting, and I think that leads me to my next point, which is we have reached the top of the hour tonight. But as we were talking about before we went live, hopefully very soon we can have both of you back in our store.
I'd love it. I'd love it.
Continued conversations about poetry there.
I'd love it. Yes.
And thank you both so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Listen, I will really cherish this. I love the fact that this is being taped so other people can see it later. I can see it again. And I'm just so grateful, John, for you hosting this for us. And Keith Taylor, my good and dear friend and colleague, for you to ask about Liesl Mueller. You don't know what that means to me. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you all. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining. Of course, you can pre-order The Blue Divide at the link in the chat. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are links to purchase in the description below. Take care, all. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.